Thank you for this invitation. As part of this occasion, I would have liked to have imposed upon you my Kannada, but I was told that it's a mixed audience and it would be better if we had the talk in English. It's always a pleasure to come to Christ. ಈ ಒಂದು ಸಂದರ್ಭ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಕ್ಕೆ ತುಂಬ ಸಂತೋಷ, ತುಂಬ ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳು. Yeah, it's always a pleasure to come to this place. I see myself as an unofficial faculty here, I guess. Whenever I get a chance to come to meet and talk to students and faculty, it's always been a great pleasure. And even before I finished that email, I said, yes, I would love to come, to have a chance to talk, particularly because it was a occasion of the Kannada Sangha. And it's the question about Kannada for me was very important, and like I was talking to Dr. Prasad now about, the politics of Kannada and the importance of trying to understand languages. And I want to talk a little bit about that question, about the idea of languages and the importance of engaging with multiple languages. So when I thought about this topic, then one of the suggestions was philosophy and literature, and it's such a vast topic. Both are humongous terms, one philosophy, one literature. And the easiest thing in the spirit of true Kannada spirit, the bisibele bath, which is you take everything and put an and into it. Take some dal, rice, and beans, and carrot, and some masala, that's your bisibele bath. It's actually a dish of the and. But what does this and actually mean between philosophy and literature? What exactly are they how are they even speaking to each other? Actually, very interestingly, the word and it has very interesting discussions right from the use of other languages, like a linguist, like Rola might know more, like how we would use in Sanskrit, for example, or in other terms. The and is a very interesting term. And if you ask in English, one of the things when I teach philosophy of language, I begin by asking, okay, how do you know the meaning of chair, for example? I can point to things. We can talk about concepts. But if I ask them to tell me the meaning of and, it's one of the most difficult questions for students to answer. Because you ask, what is and? Like, for example, a lot of philosophy was built, like Vijay Shankar, we were talking about Heidegger, for example, on just the word is. What is the meaning of the word is? How do we talk about that meaning? How do you unpack that meaning? So, when we talk about the word and, the meaning of and is largely driven from logic. The definition of and it's actually, and comes as a logical term. It has a particular function when you understand logic and its relationship to language. It's a very fascinating discussion about, for example, the three most important terms in English, most used, least understood terms, and or not, are all three fundamentally philosophical terms. They are not, I often exasperatedly tell my students, and I can see how much more exasperated they get at me, when I tell them and or not are not English words. They're actually not English words. They have nothing to do with English, actually, as a language. They are words which have a particular function, a logical function. And that logic, in that sense, is actually something to do with philosophy, because logic is a branch of philosophy. It used to be the most basic first branch of philosophy that you would study before you studied the other branches of philosophy. So, there is the question of whether philosophy and literature are different or related, etc., all become moot because in a particular sense, there is no possibility of you thinking of anything without some notion of philosophical thinking. Some idea of philosophical thought. That is, if we look at philosophy as a very broad idea, and a broad idea is what is philosophy? Philosophy can be a worldview, how you look at the world. Philosophy is about asking certain kinds of foundational questions. It's about clarifying concepts. The moment I ask the question, what is literature? That is not a question within literature, strictly speaking. When you ask a definition of what is this object, or what does the word chair mean, you are actually asking a very standard, prototypical philosophical question. That is the nature of philosophical inquiry. So when I'm even to ask the question, what is literature? And then if you start asking the question, what is good literature? What differentiates this kind of writing from that kind of writing? You are actually doing philosophy without maybe calling it philosophy. So the fact that philosophy is very general and in a sense very generic means that it has penetrated almost all the questions we think about. And that's why it's not an accident that the mother discipline of all disciplines is philosophy. And it is from philosophy as a discipline that all other disciplines come, including the sciences. Okay, remember, just to remind you of this, in case you don't, I always like to tell this very small story that even the founder of so-called father of modern physics, which is Isaac Newton, which I'm sure all of you have heard of, he was not called a scientist, he was called a philosopher. His title was a natural philosopher, because philosophy was the common domain of action, of human thought. So any discipline which had to deal with notions of human thinking was supposed to be what was called as philosophy. So now if you ask the question, philosophy and literature, what we are actually acknowledging is the fact that it was impossible to think of literature outside philosophy, but there has been an artificial separation, and now you're trying to put things back together. Whenever you talk about philosophy and science, for example, philosophy and literature, philosophy and arts, etc., what we are basically acknowledging is the fact that what came out from one given common origin, something called, if you want to call it a mother discipline, and then you have had all these children out, and then they've got estranged, they have not been on speaking terms, and now you want to try and make them speak to each other. And when you try and make them speak to each other, after all these moments of fight between them, it's not going to be a pleasant sight. They don't talk to each other. There's very little ways in which they can talk to each other. Because the reason, if I want to look at this term today, the conflict in it comes because philosophy and literature, both very general terms, literature in a very loose sense of any kind of textual production, any written text, any kind of things to do with language as such, is present everywhere. Philosophy is also a written discourse. So philosophy is literature in that sense. Science is a literature, literary form. It is a particular form of writing. It's a particular form of producing texts and accounts and descriptions and so on. So obviously, for you to recognize that a novel is different from a scientific text needs something else for you to be able to make that distinction. Otherwise, how do you know that a novel is different from a social science text, from a scientific text or a mathematical text? So both these terms are very loose and have what we call as valency, meaning across a very broad domain. But what has happened today, why such terms become very important today, is because when disciplines get formed, they have gone far away from their original ideas. So in fact, to the extent that philosophy departments don't look too kindly on literature departments. I was telling Vijay Shankar that, a philosopher whom many of you would have studied in your English program, like Derrida, was never allowed entry into philosophy departments. When he was supposed to be given an honorary degree by Cambridge, or I think it was Cambridge, there were a very large number of philosophers wrote a petition, signed a petition saying he should not be given that because he's not a philosopher. Philosophy departments have become, again, like I was telling him, agraharas, very isolated communities which gatekeep who can come in, what you can read, how you should read those texts. I remember last year when Delhi University, their MA, they have all these departments, their MA program, the first day of this thing, and they asked me to give a talk to all their new students. And I was, giving this talk to them about what is it to do philosophy, and I was just reminding them about what I think captures the problem of philosophy in India today, which is that I said, you have a philosophy department, you have so many number of faculty and students. You know where philosophy is done in Delhi University? It's done in the political science department. It's done in the English department. It's being done in the sociology department. And none of you have any conversation with any of them. In fact, the big internal fight between philosophy and literature happened thanks to this French movement, post-Derrida, Foucault, Derrida, the whole movement around French thinkers, around this idea that there was something very sacred to the idea of philosophy which literature was not able to do. And the claims by some of these French writers, including Derrida, that philosophy and literature are not really distinguishable in some sense, in a very fundamental, profound sense, was such a major point of difference between the philosophy programs and the literature programs. To the extent that if you had students who did anything of the French thinkers, they were not given admission into philosophy departments. So I'm very happy to see a literature department or a literature program actually having such positive views towards philosophy. In the sense that they recognize the importance of philosophy in some sense in their own teaching. And for me, I don't think it's possible to do literature without philosophy. That is maybe my bias, but that's my view about what I think. What I think is the most important function of literature. For example, when I went to Manipal and set up the center, and I find an old student here, but we started interdisciplinary humanities, and it had English and philosophy and sociology programs. And for me, when I thought of that program, so there was an MA English we gave, but the MA English the students in MA English had to do philosophy as core. It is not that they had a choice of whether they want to do philosophy or not. So one part of the training was in philosophy, one part of the training was in sociology, because for me, the thought of doing literature without understanding Indian society was a bit of a problem. What constitutes the social sciences in sociology? And of course, the dominant part was on literature. But I must tell you that at the same time, for me, the philosophy students also had to do literature. To me, it was ridiculous to imagine you would do philosophy without being aware of literature or without being aware of sociology, for example. The fact that we haven't been able to continue it after I left also points to this inherent tension between literature and philosophy, because the literature group there felt that philosophy was not needed to do literature. So I grant these kinds of differences of opinions about what people will view these disciplines, but there is something, in spite of all these kinds of outward kinds of convergence, that there is something, philosophy is present in every kind of thinking we think about the world, and literature is present in every form of expression. That is common to all of this, but still the significant relationship between philosophy and literature is not captured in these generic similarities. I want to point to one particular aspect of similarities, which to me is the most important aspect of even invoking the ideas of philosophy and literature, and why both of them are concerned. It is impossible to separate philosophy and literature because of one particular question which is important both to philosophy and to literature. Okay, I'm going to spend my last part of it a little bit on that to try and see if I can convince you about particular ways of looking at this. So as I said, the ways in which they have moved as disciplines. So philosophy as a discipline has particular preoccupation. So remember that the word discipline itself is, the most nicest way to put it, it's a form of disciplining your thinking about something. So to enter into your discipline is to discipline your ways of thinking about looking at something, looking at particular objects. So philosophy as such is made up of other disciplines, sub-disciplines. For example, logic, but also concerns about questions of reality. What is the real? How do I understand the nature of the real? It's one of the central questions of philosophical thinking. Now, what is real and what is not real is a question which a child asks. And in fact, some of the best workshops I've actually been doing in the last few years has been with children. When I do philosophy for children camp, I remember when we first announced it and I wanted to do it, people said, why would, which child wants to do philosophy? And not only that, they also told me no parent will send their children to do philosophy. But we had so many people who were very interested in it, and I found it was such a learning experience for me to be able to deal with children in their way. They started asking questions about what we were doing in the name of philosophy. So there are different disciplines within the philosophy. So it tells you, question of reality or something which is very common. Children have a very fertile imagination, right? Remember that one of the most important pointers of children's experiences is that many children keep talking to an invisible friend or a friend who is not with them. But some of their closest friends are other children whom others do not see. So when they play, they'll be sitting with them, they will be doing something, they're actually talking to them without any, they're not self-conscious about it. You know, like we would be self-conscious if I'm sitting somewhere and talking to somebody and nobody's around me. And they build a whole narrative around it. They build a whole story around that. And one of the interesting things they keep coming back to is this question of reality. They don't get the question. When you ask them, are you sure there is another person there? Are you sure you're seeing another person? Is the other person really there? So parents, some parents have told me they get very worried about it when they see their child talking to a non-existent friend. And they feel, oh, there's something really problematical. But it's actually a wonderful example of the way in which they're able to understand a deeper sense of what it means to be real. You know, and so this is very common with children. So the fundamental question of philosophy is this question of what is real. And it is asked in very different branches of philosophy, like metaphysics, ontology, and so on. And within that, there are particular questions which they frame. So as I was also saying, there is nothing monolithic about philosophy. Today, if you look at philosophy departments, typically all departments are broken into two schools at least. One is the analytical philosophy and continental philosophy. Much of the philosophy you may do in English programs, for example, come from the continental tradition, like Hegel, Heidegger, or the German tradition, or the French theoretical tradition. The continental tradition is very special to Anglo-American schools, you know, Britain, Australia, and some universities in the US, which are very dominantly about questions of what they call as, analytical philosophy. The analytical philosophy is what? It is a question of, it's a very scientific, to me, it's a very weak scientific way of philosophizing. Asking questions about, for example, primarily about language. So they look at language as a scientific study of some kind. So linguistics is one part of it, but analytical philosophy is a particular approach to solving philosophical problems from the scientific manner. That is their way they define themselves. It comes from a long tradition of philosophers who were reacting to people like Kant and Hegel and others, saying, what are these Germans writing about? They're making, nonsensical sentences and people think they're very profound. Actually, they don't mean anything much. And a critique of that led to analytical philosophy, which comes from a particular argument which says clarity, simplicity is the focus of any intellectual work. So all academic writing, like in the sciences, biology does not ask the large question, what is life? The most common teenage philosophical question we all have, what is life? What am I doing here? Those are not scientific questions. Biological questions are about one single molecule or some DNA, some small strand, something is broken. So that is the analytical philosophical framework by which I look at text. So I can look at literary text, I can look at a novel from an analytical philosophical framework, which actually could be quite boring according to me. But you also have this larger continental philosophical tradition, which raises fundamental questions about nature of writing, nature of language, and so on. So within philosophy, you have this very, very strong division. It's a division which does not speak to each other. So in departments in which you have analytical philosophy, you will not have continental philosophy people in it, and vice versa. And there's a lot of tension between the two. And on top of it, there are other kinds of philosophies like world philosophies, like Indian philosophy. What do you do with something like Indian philosophy? And Indian philosophy could mean many different things. It could mean Sanskritic philosophies, it could mean Buddhist philosophy, Jaina, Nyaya, the logical traditions, and so on. And in India itself, for a very long time, Indian philosophy was taught in Sanskrit departments, not in philosophy departments. So, I think philosophy departments are quite messed up, actually. Because there are just these contradictory things and you don't know what to see as philosophy, etc. And then to come and look at it in the context of literature or arts raises some really interesting new questions for us to think about. What does it mean then for a literature program to draw upon philosophy? Which kind of philosophy will we draw upon? Now, to me, that is the reason I do philosophy. Given all these problems, to me, when I do philosophy or when I think philosophically, it is about what it does for me is it gives me a clarity of what I'm trying to understand. So I do all my things which I do, all my work are only answering questions to myself which I don't understand. I have a particular phenomena, I am not able to make sense of it. I'm exploring ways to think through it. And philosophy gives me the kinds of tools and techniques to do that. And So in the context of literature, you can use the same kind of philosophical questions to ask questions about literature, which maybe as practices of literature you may not, but in terms of functions of literature you may want to ask. For example, as I said, one classic philosophical question is often about definitions. What is something? What is science? What is literature, etc. For those of whom it is an important question, you will have to ask that question, what is literature, sometime or the other. Because remember, in the name of literature, something is being taught to you and something is being denied to you. So what constitutes literature? So the question of canons, which books you should be reading, why should you read Shakespeare and maybe not Kalidas? So it's a question which has been asked in various things, right? So how would one answer that question? It's not about what you decide to choose. How do you even address this kind of a question? Then the question of what gives value to certain kinds of works which you think is important to teach, but not other kinds of works. So how do you choose those kind of things? So all these kinds of questions, as I said, need a particular method of resolving, particular method of understanding. And for that, philosophy has often been drawn upon not in the name of philosophy, but in various other ways. So it's almost become commonsensical in some sense within disciplines like literature to use philosophical ideas without necessarily worrying where the philosophical ideas came from. My only small complaint about the use of philosophy, for example, in literature and other disciplines, is actually related to this. You see, many times what happens is, for example, one of the most important influences in literature, literary studies, as you know, is existentialism. And I think that's been the most, as far as I've seen from all literature students, everybody has had some engagement with existentialism, Sartre, Camus, etc. Also because they also produce novels, literary work. So you have both of them working at a similar time. So you feel that they are actually something similar to each other. But you read Nausea, for example, by Sartre, and you read his work on consciousness and being and nothingness and so on. It's like complete different kind of texts. They don't even speak to each other. What Sartre is doing from his idea of one version of phenomenology is very different from what he is doing in his plays or his novels. There's actually very little amount of speech between the two, communication between the two. But where philosophy enters, and this is a typical way in which people, when they talk about whether a novel is philosophical or whether philosophical things are present, is to say that, well, there are philosophical themes present in it. So existentialism is taken up as a philosophical theme within a particular branch of philosophy, asking the question of what is existence. Because existence is one of the bread and butter concepts of philosophy. A lot of early philosophy begins with the questions of what is existence? How do I define the existence of an object? Does existence differ from an idea of essence? The essence existence question, which is very important for existentialism. Now, what I'm saying is, when as a literature student you read this, you encounter existentialism, how much of the history of philosophy would help you understand these texts better? Why this point about existence? What is so special about existence? Why does existence bother the existentialist so much? That question, the answer to that is coming from where? For Sartre and the philosophical tradition, they're all talking to a history of philosophy, a very constructed history of philosophy, which goes back to the Greeks in the name of Western philosophy. It is also speaking back to something of Husserl and post-Husserl, Heidegger, the Second World War, and then the French Communist Party, and then these people trying to discover some new ways of living in France. So the literary texts that you're reading are philosophical in some loose sense, but for you to really engage with it philosophically, does it expect you to engage with the history of that question without understanding why the concept existence is a problem? Is all these existentialist texts which seem philosophical, are they really philosophical to you? I'm raising the larger question of what does it mean to draw upon philosophy to reflect on other texts? In other words, when philosophers are engaging with a concept, they are engaging with a concept. And they're engaging with the concept historically and mining it through it in different ways, trying to make sense of what is this problem of the word existence? Why should we be worried about this concept called existence? Okay, it's a very fascinating question. Any of you have any questions on it, we can come back later to it. But what comes out in the long, literary thing, which has an influence not just with the French writers, but with Kannada writers, with writers in India, with a particular modernist response to literature, it has a very deep impact because it is asking questions about the nature of human life. It is formulated in some way within philosophy. It's formulated in a different way within literature. I don't see that as a problem. All I'm saying is, when I'm teaching philosophy to literature students, what am I really expecting? What do I want to do? What do I want you to learn about philosophy that it makes meaningful to you? Now, that's, I think, a larger question. But what I want to do is to actually, as I said, use these examples to illustrate this one central core relationship between these two. One central point, which to me is fascinating. It's part of a lot of my work. I keep coming back to it, including this novel, Following a Prayer. It's actually about language. It's about the difficulty of telling a story, using language, because there are a lot of assumptions about it. So, and I think that's a very important philosophical question which is central to literature. It keeps coming, whether you are consciously use it that way or not. It is the heart of what we would want to call as a literary heartbeat, if you like, if I want to sound a bit dramatic about it. And this is a very interesting question. And independent of philosophy literature question, I'm sure this is a question you have thought about in different ways, whether you're philosophy students or not. And very probably if you're not philosophy students, because this is a question which is there part of your daily life. And as I said, there is one theme which philosophy is concerned about. So I'm going to use these two themes, one theme which is common to both, and show you how they actually lead to a very fertile interaction between the two. The one theme which philosophy is fundamentally concerned about, as I said, is reality. In fact, the question of what is real is, I would say, the most common question to all disciplines. Science asks the same question. So when philosophers are asking the question, what is real, their fundamental problem is this, right? And this is the age-old fundamental question posed in all philosophical traditions. So if you look at Indian philosophical traditions, they too begin with the same question about perception. What do I see? And whenever I see when I see something, I am always asking what is behind it. And what we mean by that is, we all recognize that the world appears to us in a particular way, but there is a reality which is behind that world of appearance. And that is actually driven from a very simple observation, a simple experience, that what we see is not the way the world is. It's such a simple observation, as I said, children recognize this so deeply, that what I see is not what there is. So the chair is red, chair is not red. In the night, it's not red. If I'm colorblind, it's not red. To a dog, it's not red. To various other creatures in the world, it's not red. So the chair is not red. And the task of any act of intellect in this case, and you can see why the whole long history of the intellect comes here, is because all our senses, these five perceptive senses that we have, do not give us the truth. They only give us the surface appearance. They can only show you the world, but they cannot give you the truth of the world. So, for a physicist, for a scientist who is looking at the chair, the truth of the chair is not the red color. The least important part of physics is the red color. Or that it is soft for me to sit or comfortable for me to sit. They are not even information relevant for science. The truth of it is in its atomic structure. And that atomic structure, for science at least, lies as the truth behind this appearance of this particular chair. Now, what is true with our perceptions is true for everything in our world. The way I see another person, the way I interact with another person, the way I judge another thing, the way I judge aesthetics, for example. And you can see why the question of the suspicion towards the senses, which drives a lot of Western philosophical thinking, leading up to creation of all our modern discipline, including philosophy and literature, is based on the fact that you cannot trust your five senses. But if you cannot trust your five senses, what within you will allow you to access the truth. If you don't have the five senses, how are you going to access the truth? And that's why if you look at the Indian philosophical term for philosophy, it's darshana, which is actually sight. And it is the capacity to see the truth, which is philosophy in that sense. Not capacity to see the world. To see the world, we are fooled all the time. Right? Now, this obsession about truth, this obsession about the reality behind the world of appearance, filters down to all disciplines. Any discipline which has the pretensions of being an academic discipline, which has the pretensions of being theoretical in any sense of the word, will make this move. Different kinds of descriptions, explanation, expressions, etc. How do you know that your language has the capacity to do it? It is this fundamental struggle between language as the only tool to reality. Remember that if we did not have language, can any of us talk about reality? In fact, my novel starts with this particular puzzle. Again, I'm just writing to solve a puzzle. You have in this world, and this girl is lost in the forest, and there are millions of creatures. None of them speak a language. It's only the human who speaks a language. And she comes up with this, for whatever reason, that you have to read the story for finding out why. She comes up with this very strong belief, which is related to some notions of religion and so on, that language is a lie. And it's only humans who lie because humans have languages. If you did not have languages, you cannot lie. It's this struggle about what language is and what is so special to all of us that we possess language. And you know, literature is all about language. Literature is not concerned about reality. It doesn't, for literature, it is this acceptance of language. Accepting the appearance of language before it. It doesn't even ask what is the true nature of language behind. This engagement with the idea of language, which is the heart of literature, puts it in fundamental conflict, or the question within philosophy, whose fundamental question is, how can I trust language to do the job? And remember, historically, language does not do the job of representation well. If you look at religious traditions, all religious traditions go back to their special languages. It had to be Hebrew, Latin, Sanskrit. Because spoken language, like Prakrit, and that was Buddha's argument about Sanskrit and Prakrit, right? Ordinary spoken language cannot capture truth like these special languages can. So the language of the gods is indeed special, because the language of the humans is contaminated. It lies. It cannot capture the truth. You need to do something to that language to make it speak the truth. Such a deep thing, it has gone into all of us. It enters into science in a very interesting way. When Galileo is forming, he's seen as a father of modern science, and he's the one who first gives us an idea of what science is. And his definition of science is beautiful. It's one line. And even today it's applicable. He says, science is a description of nature, natural phenomena, which is fine. Even poetry is a description of natural phenomena. But science is a description of natural phenomena using only measurable concepts. That is, using only those words or concepts which can have value, which can be measured. So, like I often use the example, I drop a stone, it falls down, I can write a poem about it, I can sing a song about it, I can draw a picture about how it's falling. But if I want to do a scientific description, I have to describe that fall in terms of concepts which can be measured. That is height, time, speed, etc. And to him, and this is the crucial point here, for Galileo, it is scientific if you speak in the true language of mathematics. The measurable concepts is mathematical concepts. So he goes to something which is very theological, a step which he makes when he says, nature is written in the language of mathematics. The true language for nature is mathematics, not any other language. And that is why to do science is to write it in mathematics. And if you think this is very far removed from literature, you have to go back to the first question of talking about other people, cultures. And this is a fight I've had with so many writers. Fight in the sense, good discussion, because I've had wonderful learning experience, particularly a lot of Kannada writers and so on, which is, can I write about Kannada society in English? Okay? Part of my own, I've had bigger fights with this Indian English writing stuff, because part of the point was, can you write about Indian societal experiences in English, was a question, okay? And again, it's a great discussion. I'm sure you've talked about it. Otherwise, you can have a discussion about it later on. But I'm not interested in the answers to it. Look at the assumptions here. The assumption is that every experience has a special language for it. Like the experience of religion needs the language of, as I said, Hebrew, Latin, Sanskrit, etc., or the belief that it needed it. I know people who have called, this is, linguists often point out that the Italians and the French think their language is the language of love. That no language in the world can capture love like French and Italian can. They may be partly true, because I can't imagine expressing love in German. I don't know German, but what movies I've seen of German, it doesn't seem very conducive to that. But I know of people, for example, musicians, who swear that the truest language for Carnatic music is Telugu. And I had a friend who was a great fan of shairis, this Urdu poems. And for him, that was the only language of poetry. He said, I cannot read poetry in any other language, because Urdu is a language of poetry. What I'm trying to say, this is not so different from Galileo thinking mathematics is the language of nature. And therefore, so what does it mean? It means language is an appearance. The truth is to discover the true language which captures something. Science is captured by mathematical language. Urdu captures something about the poetics, etc., etc., right? So you have to ask yourself this question. When we talk about, for example, can we capture, if I'm trying to tell a story, let's say of something which happens in a small, wherever, let's say a very Kannada experience in whatever sense, okay? Whatever that means, that is something which culture studies will have to tell us how to do that. But let's assume there is something called a Kannada experience, it's happening, and I'm writing about it. Am I being inauthentic in using a language which is not Kannada? What is happening if I'm talking about it in other languages about that? On the other hand, it is also very simple, because language is never about just representation, it's always political. It is also easy for me to write it in English, because I may have other kinds of conveniences based on that. But in doing so, I may be missing the essence of that cultural experience. Whether it's true or not, how do you even think about it? To think about it, you have to go back and ask this question, not only what a language is, what is the relationship between language and reality? And this to me is the fundamental question of philosophy. In a very important way, from different kind of directions, you come to this question, what is the relationship between language and reality? And which in the case of literature, is the question which is asked to you is this, is language itself real? As literature students, do you think language is real? In any sense, you can think of whichever way you want to think about it. Is language real at all? And so when I'm talking about the use of philosophy in literature, for example, I'm not just talking about literary theory, I'm talking about these fundamental philosophical questions which should make you enter into the question of literature. Because from that you can see what every other kinds of literary theories are doing. When you ask the question, is language itself real? Is what is real about language sounds? But sounds are very different type of reality than a chair. A chair is real in a different way than sounds are real. Sounds are very ephemeral. They have come and they have gone. So if you think language is real, in what sense is it real? And if it is not real, how does it have the capacity to capture the real? Okay, I don't know if this question is confusing, but it's an extremely important puzzle about language and reality. If your language itself so you have a world of the real, whatever you call as a real. I'm using language to talk about it. Without language, I am like a dog. I can just stare at it. Maybe I can wag my tail if I have a tail. That's all I can do when I'm looking at the real. There's nothing I can tell you about it. But we as humans want to immediately start talking. Even before we see the real, we want to talk. In fact, the only reality we have is language. The first thing we do is talk, even before understanding it, right? So I have language with me, and I have the world of real. They both seem very different. The world of real is tangible, something which I can hold, do things with. The world of language is completely ephemeral. I cannot hold on to it at all. Yet, how is it that this kind of a thing called language is so ephemeral, transitory, gives you the deepest truths about the world of the real? What a wonderful question. And, if you look at both, whether it is science, literature, arts, or philosophy, one of the ways in which you want to come to a question and answer to that is to recognize that what we see as real is itself transitory and ephemeral. And that perhaps the deepest reality is language. That, especially for the Heideggerian idea, that it is not we who speak language, that language speaks us in some very fundamental, primordial sense, is just an expression of the fact that what we may think, that this world is actually tangible, real, etc., it is not. That world of reality cannot be my definition of reality. One of the first simplest examples without confusing more, and let me tell you about the chair. I mean, Rola, you started this, so don't blame me on it. The chair is not hard. You think it's physical because it's hard, right? The chair is not hard. Why do you call it hard? Hard because if you sit on it, you don't fall through it, right? That's why you call it hard. There are millions of objects which are passing through the chair. It's not hard for chair is not hard for millions of particles which are going right through it right now. There is enough hole in each of those spaces between the chair in which things can go through. It's hard for our size. It's not hard per se. This is the point. This is the point about reality. Every definition of reality is with respect to you. It's contextual. And that contextual is not about physical. It's about my social belongingness. It's about my gender. It's about every cultural belief that I have, that I construct the reality around me. Reality is not given naively in front of me. Every step I construct it. And language, language is a cement of construction. The only way in which I construct the world is through language. Without language, I cannot construct the world of the real. I just perceive it, or I don't even know how animals are engaging in the question of the real. It is language which makes it possible for us to be able to talk about the world of the real, but language by itself is not real. That is the most fundamental paradox, which animates the philosophy literature question. I need language to talk about the real. Language is not real in the way real is. What are the implications then for everything we say in terms of literature? Okay, so one way then for me to understand larger, so remember when you talk about aesthetics and you come back to what is good literature, what is good art, similar questions about art, you're still going back to that idea that an art appears in a particular way, an artwork, let's say a painting, but the task of thinking about it is to discover the truth behind it. Maybe the aesthetic qualities or the aesthetic experience which makes it beautiful or whatever, or at least aesthetic in some sense. That already gives us a clue to one way of putting all these confused things I've been telling you together, that there is some way to understand that the intrinsic definition of literature, what is good literature, or what is literature, etc., still has a way of, is a response to this reality language question. And to me, I would look at it this way, and again, we can have discussions about it, or disagreements about it. To me, I think, so the first question about good literature, bad literature is, if I read a newspaper article on the cricket scores today, is that good literature? Are you going to keep it and teach your students for the next 20 years of today's scorecard of the India-Australia match? Maybe not. You may not want to call it literature, but you may want to call it some poem and play, etc. Great literature. You may want to teach Kuempu for many more decades, hopefully. So, there is some distinction you're making. What is the big difference then about a kind of a newspaper reporting and Kuempu, for example, or a poem or a novel, which you think is very good and which we teach, or Shakespeare and so on. Now, again, this is what I'm sure you study in different ways on how to make the distinction, but I want to connect it to what I've been talking about, language and reality. To me, I think the idea of literature as something more than just these words which are strung together, some text, arises in the moment of realization that your language is not able to do the job. There's a constant gap. So when I talk about language reality, there's a world of the real. I'm using language to represent it. I presume my language is very correct in representing it. Okay, and we are very probably wrong about it, because no language can capture the world of reality fully. And that's why I want to come back to this very important point you were talking about, that the reason why multiple languages are so essential to us is because of a very simple point. That is, one language alone cannot capture the complete complex reality even of this room. See, if I say there are 50 people in this room, I'm using the language of mathematics, right? 50 is a language of mathematics. There are 50 people in this room. But I could have said there are 50 men in this room is different. There are 25 men, 25 women in this room is different meaning. Each expression of it is actually producing a different world of reality. And no language, no single language can capture the complexity of this room. Different languages are, so languages are like windows to the world. So through the window you see one part of the world. You want to see another part of the world, you see through another window. So for anybody who thinks my language can capture this complete complexity in this room is absolutely mistaken. All that I need to do, and this is a very important point, it has other kinds of implications, is that we have to be in a world of multi-semiosis, multiple semiotic, multiple sign systems, multiple linguistic systems, in order to capture the reality. One language cannot do the job. It has a deep connection to science. No scientific text is monolingual. You do not write a text of physics. No scientific theory is just written in English. It cannot be done. It needs pictures. It uses a visual, it's a very cinematic, if you want to call it. It's got visual, it's got diagrams, it's got drawings, it's got symbols, it's like a cartoon, and it will have English in it. It needs multiple languages to capture the multiple realities present in front of us. So no single language can do it. So to me, if literature is concerned still, ask yourself this question: why is all literature just in one language? Just to provoke you into thinking about, rather than talking about entering into this question of multiple languages. Why is it only in one language? Do you think that your particular language can actually capture everything that has to be captured in that? Or if you imagine writing a novel in 3 different languages, which is what a scientific text is. 3 different languages to tell a story. Does it increase? Does it become richer in terms of its grasp of the reality? So, to me, therefore, one way to formulate this, and I'll just end with this point here, that language can never capture the world of the real. There is always a gap between them. And the idea of good literature exists in this gap. This constant attempt to reduce this gap. Literature is not just about a language which claims that, I have captured the whole thing. Great literature is often interpretative. It's often something which you can read, you'll read differently, you'll build upon it. There is this constant ambiguity, this struggle towards, and the recognition, self-recognition that you're not able to reach. Again, in major debates about language, particularly with respect to experience and religious experiences, there's this point about effability and ineffability. I'm sure you heard about this. The ineffability is the argument that there are some experiences which language can never capture. So religious experience was given as one in which you can never use language to capture it. And that's why some emotions you have, you just shout. You can't talk. Or you may sing. You have to sing. You can't just speak. Your language cannot do that job. So ineffability argument is there is always some set of experiences which you can never talk about. It comes again, as I said, the Buddhist Nyaya debate comes with Wittgenstein in another very famous quoted context and so on. The point is, it is that space, that gap, that recognition that what I am saying is not capturing what is being said. That, to me, creates great writing. You know that. You're trying to do something, you're trying to say something, but you still know that you're not able to say everything that you want to say. And it is in that struggle I'm able to figure out something about it. To me, that produces this particular space of, the recognition that the impossibility of language and that the impossibility of language to capture everything of the world is the most important sense of this relationship between language and the world. It is not the false confidence that literature captures the world as it is. I've told you the way the world, the story is really. No. It is that moment of vulnerability, that moment of incompleteness, that moment of striving to reaching that, knowing that I'm not able to do it, but I'm trying to tell you. That's why in the context of writing stories, for me, the first question always is, I can't tell a story because I first have to ask, how is it that my language is able to tell this story? What is the belief in me that I'm able to tell the story without thinking about the language that I use? Right? So that kind of a reflection on it raises a very fundamental relationship between these two. And therefore, I think, to end the last point, I think therefore what literature really does, how it illuminates philosophy, is in some sense to teach philosophers about what language really is. Philosophers talk about language in a very abstract sense. Like linguists talk about it in an abstract sense, when they can analyze it in terms of scientific units. Philosophers talk about language in an abstract sense. But it is the wordsmiths, the people who use language in literature, in essay or poetry, that were really working with language. And to me, in a sense, reflecting, I guess, somewhere upon Heidegger and many others, that poetry captures the essence of philosophy in a very deep sense, because it is, you have to, poetry is not about representation. Poetry is about language itself. It's not about what the language is saying. It's not what it is about. Poetry is about doing things with language, not doing things with ideas, not doing things with content. It is that absolute immersion in the experience of language. That is, you have to ask yourself the question, very often, what we do is, we use language to talk about the world, we never experience language. So I remember when I was teaching this course on language, I would tell my students, if you want to know what language is, listen to your language which you don't understand. Just sit and listen. You have no clue what is being said, but you start listening to the sounds, because all language is sound, first and foremost sound, before meaning. You start listening to the sound, you begin to know what the experience of language is. How do you immerse yourself in a language? For us it's so difficult, because every time you listen to a word, you're already thinking of its meaning, you're thinking of all its associations. It's impossible for us to be in language. It's only poetry which can drag you back to the experience of language. And it drags you back to the primacy argument that language is real because of poetry. Not language is real because it's defining the world. There is something in just that immersion of those words and sounds which are not representing anything that truly captures what language really is. And that is a lesson which philosophy has to learn from literature and writers about what language really is. Although a lot of philosophy is invested in this question of language and reality, it still does not have the experience of language that comes from literature. And I think it is in that kind of a junction that you really have to reflect upon how you can meaningfully think of either literature and philosophy together, or in various ways of talking to each other. Thank you so much.